Have you ever thought about what it would be like to get paid regularly just for existing? No strings attached, no need to work for it, just a guaranteed income.
Yeah,
That's the big idea behind universal basic income, or UBI, and today we're going to be looking at if this kind of radical concept could actually work.
yeah, it's super interesting how this idea is gaining traction now of all times. We're
Yeah.
seeing a huge shift in, how we work with automation and AI changing the job market at an incredible pace.
Absolutely. To understand this better, we are diving into excerpts from a Spanish research paper, La Renta Básica Universal, un debate sobre el futuro económico y social, which translates to universal basic income, a debate on the economic and social future,
Right.
for those of us who don't speak Spanish.
Of course.
This paper really digs into how UBI could be a response to these massive tech changes we're seeing.
Yeah, one of the key points it makes is that traditional safety nets like unemployment benefits are designed for a world where jobs are relatively stable. But what happens when entire job categories start disappearing due to automation? That's a whole new ballgame.
Right. It's not just about losing your job and finding a new one in the same field. Some jobs might just vanish altogether.
Exactly.
So how does UBI fit into this picture?
Well, the paper argues that UBI could act as a kind of buffer against this rapid change. Instead of scrambling to retrain for jobs that might also become automated soon, UBI could give people the breathing room to adapt in different ways.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Instead of constantly reacting to job losses, people could have this stability to proactively build new skills or even start their own ventures.
Exactly.
But before we get too deep into the possibilities, let's break down exactly what UBI is and how it works.
Yeah, for sure. The paper defines UBI using some key characteristics. It's universal, meaning every citizen gets it, rich or poor. It's unconditional, no hoops to jump through, no means testing. It's also periodic, meaning you receive it regularly, like a paycheck.
So it's not a one-time handout. It's a consistent source of income.
Right.
And the paper also emphasizes that UBI is independent, meaning it wouldn't replace existing social programs like healthcare or disability benefits.
Exactly. It's meant to be a base layer of economic security for everyone. Some people compare it to a dividend paid to all citizens regardless of their stock in society.
That's a helpful way to think about it. It's not about rewarding certain behaviors. It's about acknowledging everyone's right to a basic standard of living. But of course, this raises a lot of questions. Is this even feasible? What about the impact on the economy?
Those are exactly the questions the research paper tackles. It explores both the potential upsides and downsides of UBI.
Okay, so let's start with the good stuff. What are some of the key benefits that the paper highlights?
Well, the most obvious one is poverty reduction. The idea is that by providing a guaranteed income floor, you could effectively eliminate extreme poverty. But what's interesting is that the paper goes beyond this surface-level benefit and dives into the potential mechanisms by which UBI could reduce poverty.
So it's not just about handing out money. It's about how that money might change the dynamics of poverty.
Exactly. The paper suggests that UBI could empower individuals in a way that traditional welfare programs often don't. It could provide a sense of agency and control over one's financial situation, leading to better decision-making and potentially breaking cycles of poverty.
That's a pretty compelling argument. It's not just about alleviating symptoms. It's about addressing some of the underlying causes of poverty.
Right. And the paper also discusses the potential for UBI to reduce economic inequality. Instead of relying on a patchwork of targeted programs, UBI would create a more level playing field by ensuring everyone has at least a basic level of income.
So it's not just about lifting people out of poverty. It's about closing the gap between the richest and poorest in society. But let's be realistic. There have to be some potential drawbacks.
Right.
Implementing something this sweeping can't be all sunshine and rainbows.
You're absolutely right. The paper acknowledges that UBI isn't a magic bullet. There are some significant challenges and criticisms that need to be carefully considered.
All right, let's dive into the potential dark side of UBI. What are some of the major concerns raised in the paper?
One of the biggest and most obvious is the cost. Implementing a universal basic income on a national scale would require a massive amount of government funding. The paper delves into various potential funding mechanisms like higher taxes or cuts to other programs, but there's no easy answer here. It would require some major economic restructuring.
And even if you could figure out how to pay for it, there are concerns about how UBI might affect people's motivation to work. If you're needing a guaranteed income, would you still be willing to take on low-wage jobs?
That's a common concern and one that the paper addresses directly. It actually distinguishes between UBI and concepts like a negative income tax or a guaranteed minimum income. These other approaches often involve phasing out benefits as income increases, which can create disincentives to work.
So with those models, you might actually lose money by working more, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? But with UBI, everyone gets the same amount regardless of their earnings.
Precisely. The paper argues that this could actually make UBI more work-friendly than traditional means-tested programs. People could take on part-time work or pursue passion projects without fear of losing their benefits.
That's a really important distinction. It seems like a lot of the concerns about work disincentives stem from a misunderstanding of how UBI differs from other forms of social assistance.
Exactly. But even with a pure UBI model, there are still questions about the overall impact on the labor market. Would employers need to raise wages to attract workers? Would people be less willing to take on jobs they find unfulfilling?
Those are some big questions, and it seems like there's no easy answer without looking at real-world examples.
You're absolutely right. Fortunately, the research paper delves into exactly that, real-world trials of UBI in different countries. These trials offer some fascinating insights into how UBI actually plays out in practice.
So we've talked about the theory behind UBI, both the potential benefits and the challenges, but I'm really curious to hear about these real-world experiments the paper mentions. What can we actually learn from how UBI has been tested in the real world?
Yeah, these trials offer a fascinating glimpse into what a UBI society could look like, and the results are often more nuanced than people might expect. The paper covers a range of experiments from Finland to Kenya, each with its own unique approach.
That's what makes it so interesting, right? It's not just a one-size-fits-all concept. We're seeing how UBI might work in different cultures and economies. What were some of the standout examples for you?
One that often catches people's attention is the Finnish trial. They provided a basic income to 2,000 unemployed citizens for 2 years. What's intriguing is that the primary goal wasn't to boost employment rates.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive. If people are getting free money, wouldn't you want to see if it helps them get jobs?
Yeah, that's the traditional thinking, but the Finnish trial took a different approach. They wanted to see how UBI would affect people's well-being and sense of agency.
So it was more about the social and psychological impact of UBI.
Exactly, and the findings were quite revealing. Recipients reported feeling less stressed, healthier, and more confident in their ability to pursue opportunities.
So even if it didn't lead to a significant increase in employment, it seems like it had a positive impact on their overall quality of life.
That's a key takeaway. It challenges the assumption that UBI would simply make people lazy or complacent. In fact, some participants used the basic income to pursue further education or start their own businesses.
It's like it gave them the freedom to invest in themselves and explore new possibilities without the immediate pressure of finding traditional employment.
That's a great point, and that's something we see reflected in other trials as well. The Kenyan experiment, for example, showed a significant increase in self-employment and small business creation among those receiving a basic income.
So in that case, UBI seemed to actually stimulate economic activity rather than hinder it.
Precisely, it provided a safety net that allowed people to take risks and pursue opportunities they might not have been able to otherwise.
I'm also curious about the Spanish trial mentioned in the paper. They used a guaranteed minimum income model, which I understand is a bit different from pure UBI.
That's right. The Spanish program called Ingreso Mínimo Vital targeted low-income households and included some additional requirements like actively seeking employment.
So it's like a hybrid model that combines elements of UBI with traditional welfare programs.
Exactly. It's too early to draw definitive conclusions about the long-term effects of this model, but it offers an interesting example of how countries are adapting the concept of basic income to fit their specific contexts.
It seems like all these experiments are adding valuable pieces to the puzzle, even if they don't provide a clear-cut answer to the question of whether UBI is a good idea or not.
Absolutely, and that's the beauty of scientific research. It's a process of continuous learning and refinement. Each trial provides new data points, new insights that can help us shape future policies.
It's like we're building a body of evidence piece by piece to inform a more nuanced and data-driven conversation about UBI. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't just a dry academic debate. There are real human stories behind these trials.
You're absolutely right. The paper touches on some of the personal experiences of people who participated in these experiments. It's easy to get lost in the economic arguments, but at the end of the day, this is about how UBI could impact people's lives on a very personal level.
Do any particular stories stand out to you?
One that resonates with me is from the Finnish trial. A single mother shared how the basic income allowed her to spend more quality time with her children without the constant stress of financial insecurity. She was able to focus on her family's well-being and even pursue some creative interests she'd long abandoned.
That's so powerful. It speaks to the potential of UBI to not just improve material conditions, but also foster a sense of well-being and freedom that can ripple outwards to families and communities.
Exactly. And in the Kenyan trials, some entrepreneurs shared how the basic income provided the crucial capital they needed to get their businesses off the ground. It wasn't a handout, it was an investment in their potential that ultimately benefited the entire community.
It really challenges the narrative of UBI as a drain on society.
Hmm.
Doesn't it highlights how economic security can actually unleash creativity and productivity.
It certainly complicates the conversation in a positive way. It forces us to move beyond simplistic assumptions and engage with the complexity of how UBI might play out in the real world.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It's not just about numbers and statistics. It's about people, their hopes, their dreams, and their ability to thrive in a changing world.
You've hit the nail on the head. The debate about UBI is ultimately a debate about the kind of society we want to create, the values we prioritize, and the future we envision.
And that's a conversation worth having, even if it gets messy and complicated. We can't shy away from these tough questions, especially as the world of work continues to evolve at an unprecedented pace.
You're absolutely right. We need to be bold in our thinking, open to new ideas, and willing to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Mm.
From the theoretical underpinnings of UBI to the real-world trials that are putting it to the test.
Right.
What does it all mean for the future?
Right.
Is UBI destined to remain a fringe idea, or could it actually become a mainstream reality?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as with most complex issues, the answer isn't a simple yes or no. You know, the research paper we've been discussing explores a range of factors that could shape the future of UBI. And it all comes down to a delicate interplay of, economic, political, and social forces.
So it's not just about whether UBI is a good idea in principle. It's about whether the conditions are right for it to actually take root and flourish.
Precisely. One crucial factor the paper highlights is political will for UBI to gain widespread adoption. It would require a significant shift in the political landscape. We need policymakers who are willing to champion this idea, to challenge the status quo, and to advocate for the kind of systemic changes that would be necessary to implement a program of this magnitude.
So it's not just about tweaking existing policies. It's about a fundamental rethinking of how we approach social welfare and economic security.
You've got it. And that kind of shift often requires a groundswell of public support. People need to understand UBI to see its potential and to demand it from their elected officials.
It's interesting that the paper mentions how the COVID-19 pandemic actually played a role in bringing UBI into the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, it was a real turning point. Suddenly, millions of people were facing economic hardship, and governments around the world were forced to experiment with new forms of social safety nets. In some cases, these programs resembled UBI, providing direct cash payments to citizens with no strings attached.
So it was like a massive, unplanned real-world experiment that showed how quickly traditional welfare systems can be overwhelmed during times of crisis.
Exactly. And it seems to have opened a lot of people's eyes to the limitations of our current systems and the potential benefits of a more universal approach to economic security.
So in a way, the pandemic might have inadvertently paved the way for UBI to gain more traction. But political will and public support are only part of the equation. What about the technological landscape? We've talked a lot about how automation is changing the world of work. Does that create a sense of urgency around finding solutions like UBI?
The paper argues that it absolutely does. As automation continues to accelerate, the potential for job displacement on a massive scale becomes more and more real. We need to be proactive in thinking about how we'll support people who are affected by these changes, and UBI could be a vital part of that solution.
It's almost like a race against time, isn't it? We need to find ways to ensure that the benefits of technological advancement are shared equitably and that people aren't left behind.
I completely agree, and this brings us back to the core values that underpin the whole UBI debate. It's not just about economics, it's about social justice, human dignity, and the kind of future we want to build.
It's about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to live a fulfilling life, regardless of the changing tides of the labor market.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it's why this conversation is so important. UBI might not be the perfect solution, but it forces us to grapple with some fundamental questions about how we value work, how we care for one another, and how we create a more just and equitable society.
And as we've seen, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. The research paper emphasizes that the design and implementation of UBI would need to be carefully tailored to the specific context of each country or region.
Absolutely. There are many different models to consider, each with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. We need to be thoughtful and deliberative in exploring these options, learning from the real world trials that are already underway, and engaging in open and honest conversations about the trade offs involved.
It's a complex issue, but that's what makes it so engaging, right? It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about understanding people, their needs, their aspirations, and their place in a rapidly evolving world.
Exactly. And I think the research paper does a great job of capturing that complexity. It doesn't shy away from the challenges, but it also highlights the immense potential of UBI to create a more humane and equitable future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. Imagine you're designing a UBI system for your own community. What would be your top priority? Would it be minimizing costs, maximizing individual freedom, ensuring everyone's basic needs are met, or perhaps something else entirely?
That's a great question, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's a thought experiment that invites us to engage with the values that underpin this debate and to imagine the kind of world we want to create.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, exploring complex ideas, challenging assumptions, and empowering you, our listeners, to think critically and engage with the big questions that are shaping our world. Thanks for joining us on this journey and keep those conversations going.